Hey guys, welcome to the OP09 review. For those who don't know me, my name is iKailaKai, and I'm a Japanese player and content creator based here in Japan. As such, I've already played OP09 for 3 months, and this is going to be a review talking about how the meta ended up settling. This video is going to be going over the meta of OP09, as well as all of the leaders that I think are in contention for the top spot. Just because a leader that you like to play is not in this list does not mean that it's not strong, it just means that there are a lot of other good choices. I also periodically make videos talking about the OP010 meta as it evolves, and I'm going to be making a couple more OP09 videos on how the meta ended up evolving, as well as some of these more niche decks that aren't reviewed in this video. If you guys are interested in that, please make sure to subscribe, and I will make sure to get that to you very soon. I am trying to hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of this year, and I think that that's possible, but I just want to see how far we can go. The goal is always number one. If you guys will be there with me, I would greatly appreciate it. Let's move on to the video. So to start, I think that it's important to point out that this meta is not as defined as the older metas. It's not necessarily as solved as maybe you would say. The reason for this is because I think that it's a rotating door meta. And in the way, it's not necessarily just choosing a deck and getting perfect at it. Although there are some decks that can do this, a lot of it is just being able to read the meta well and bring the correct deck on the correct day. This makes this meta very interesting, as there are many different decks that you can bring and lots of potential upsets that can happen. In the Japanese Championship Wave 1, we saw Red Purple Law win most of the championships. However, in the Wave 2 Championship, we did not see Doflamingo, who is considered to be the best deck in the format, win every single one. In fact, that title actually goes to Teach. But despite that, I don't think that he's the best deck in the format. There are many interesting things and many different choices, so I hope that this video can get you into the loop of this rotating door and help you figure out what you want to choose for your regionals and nationals. For visual clarity, I've made a tier list of the power of the decks in OP09. I think that Doflamingo is undisputedly the best deck in the format, and many other decks are just figuring out how do they evolve to the rotating meta as well as Doflamingo. Most decks actually can't end up doing this, which is why Doflamingo is at the top. In this video, you're going to occasionally see a chart like this. I'm going to be rating each leader on 3 metrics: the consistency of the deck, how often it can pull off its strongest move, the power of the deck, when it pulls off the strongest move, how does it stack up against other meta decks, and lastly, the ease of use. These 3 metrics will generally help people choose what decks they want to use, and I think that all of the decks that I'm talking about in this video are worth using, so choose what you think is the best for you. It's still in the process of being made, but I do have a more in-depth version of this video coming out to Patreon, and I also have a Purple Luffy guide, a couple of reviews of some of the championship games, and Cross is going to be putting out a couple of guides soon as well. I'm not sure if I'm going to end up making the Purple Luffy guide a video, so if you guys are interested in that sort of content, then please go check it out. It'll help me and, of course, Cross out. Thank you very much. Let's first talk about Doflamingo's list. I've made a guide on Doflamingo, which I'll link in the comments, but if you've seen that video, you'll know that there are many different types of Doflamingo. Still, I do think that there's a general consensus to how people have ended up putting together the Doflamingo deck in the end, and that is this. The core of this deck revolves around Jinbe and Hancock. These 2 cards help you spread your board very hard, as of course with the 4-cost Hancock on 6-tone, you can play Hancock and still use your leader effect. In this way, you can easily spread out 2 or 3 things on the board from very early turns, and many decks just don't have the ability to be able to deal with 2 4-costs on the same turn. The overall power that this deck has is undeniable, but what truly puts it over the edge is that so many of the cards in this deck draw an extra card. For example, Edward Weevil on play draws a card. Moria picks up a card from your trash. Law helps bounce a card back to your hand. There are so many cards that give you additional value, for example, Weevil having 6,000 power, Law also bouncing the opponent's characters, that also give you cards back to your hand. And in this way, Doflamingo is just a monster that can keep pushing over the opponent without ever losing cards in his hand. In this way, the package altogether is just a very aggressive, very consistent. Depending on the meta, you can tech in events such as Red Rock or Gravity Blade, but due to the fact that there aren't too many Bonnies in this meta, I've chosen to put in Gravity Blade. Though I still prefer to run the version of Doflamingo that runs 6-cost Joza, as it makes the game a lot easier, a lot of people have been finding success without the 6-cost Joza. The second strongest deck, in my opinion, is Teach. This is a bit of a difficult one to rank, as it actually doesn't have a very good Doflamingo matchup. However, I think that in the same way that Doflamingo has to be accounted for when you deck build, people also have to account for Teach. When people are building their decks, they have to think about if their deck can beat Doflamingo, and also if their deck can beat Teach. Although Teach doesn't have a very high player in Japan, you still have to consider it when you're choosing your deck, as Teach has extremely polarizing matchups. Although he loses against decks like Doflamingo, he devastates decks such as Black Luffy, Lucci, and many other decks. It's for this reason that you still see things like Purple Luffy, as Purple Luffy does have a fairly good Teach matchup, and is also the reason why you don't see too much Lucci or Black Yellow Luffy. Although Teach's play rate is not very high, he gatekeeps a lot of really strong decks from being able to be meta, and for that reason I think that he's the second strongest deck. If you can manage to avoid Doflamingo in your game day, you can actually do very well with the deck, and even when you go against Doflamingo, it's not the end of the world. A lot of the Teach versus Doflamingo matchup actually comes down to the skill level of the Doflamingo player, and if the Doflamingo player is not very good or even like relatively average, you can do very well as Teach. If I were to restart OP09 right now from a fresh slate, I probably would choose this deck, as I don't necessarily love playing Doflamingo, and he just does very well into a lot of the meta. You just need to have good luck on the day. For the Teach list, we have this. Now, this Teach list is from my friend who has been playing Teach from the start to the end of OP09. He's also been in a couple of my videos talking about Teach as well as playing against me, and the deck is almost solved. 47 out of 50 of these cards basically feel set in stone, with the last 3 either still needing to be cooked or personal preference. You may notice that this deck runs only 7 2000 counters, and although this may seem pretty small, Teach is not really a deck that is countering a lot. They generally take their life when it's safe to, and then eventually, when they start playing the 10-cost Teach, as it's a blocker, it'll help you increase your defense in the late game. In this way, actually, although maybe people might dislike the deck now that I say this, it's kind of similar to the way that NL likes to play. So if you do like NL, then maybe try this deck. It is a very complicated deck though, because it relies much more on your knowledge of the game. If you know how the opponent wants to play out their game plan, it's much easier to play Teach, as of course Teach's lead effect is very proactive. You can use your leader effect before the opponent's going to play their on-play cards, and suddenly they have to change their game plan. But if you use it at the wrong times, you're losing cards, and if you choose not to use it at the wrong times, then you're letting the opponent use their cards and gain value that they otherwise should not be able to. In this way, Teach is a very difficult deck to really get into, and maybe is not suitable for people who are new to the game, but if you are pretty familiar with the decks in the meta, maybe consider Teach, as he does have a very good matchup spread into many things that are just not Doflamingo. The next deck I want to talk about is Shanks. Now, Shanks' list has actually changed a lot throughout the meta. Most people in the early meta were actually running a very rush Shanks-inspired build, where they run the 3-cost Zoro, the 5-cost Luffy, the 8-cost Dragon, using their leader effect when it's still very valuable to get plus 1000 counter in the early game, to just push over the opponent before they can actually take back your board, because you have so much extra counter in your hand through your leader ability. The issue with this build was that it was not very good in the mirror against the control version. People were finding a lot of consistency in the Red Hair Pirates Shanks build, but the build that I'm going to show is this one, which is a kind of hybrid of both of them. You do want to have these things such as 8-cost Dragon to be able to deal with Teach, as it'll still have Rush despite not being able to use the on-play effect, and the 3-cost Zoro is also very nice and annoying into a lot of different matchups thanks to the leader ability. If you are getting into the game and you don't really know the mechanics of the game, trying to figure out the rules and the types of decks that you might face, this is actually the deck that I would recommend to you. I think that this deck is really nice because it's very simple to get the grasp of, and still has room to outplay your opponent. The general game plan for Shanks is to play on curve and eventually reach your 10-cost Shanks, where you can slowly push over the opponent, using your leader ability to help you get to that late game faster. With the game plan of trying to get to Tendong as safely as possible, you can generally win out a lot of matchups, because Shanks is just very strong. The one issue that this deck has, however, is consistency. If Shanks can always draw what he wants, he's very good, but as his top end is all different types that can't be searched, sometimes you just won't be able to pick up the cards that you need and end up losing. For example, in the Doflamingo matchup, you really want to have the 8-cost Rayleigh, but as this card's not searchable, if you just don't pick it up, you just don't have it, and then the matchup becomes a lot harder. The same thing can be said with the Teach matchup. If you don't find the 8-cost Dragon, you're in a lot of trouble as well. In this way, Shanks is a bit of a high-risk deck to bring, because the consistency is not quite there, but the power is. I think that if you are getting into the game, the deck is very fun, the character is also very recognizable and popular, and I think that lots of people will just have a lot of fun playing this deck. As for tech cards, you may notice that Lucky Roo is not in this deck. The reason why Lucky Roo is not in this deck is because in this current meta, it's kind of low value. 4 costs can be bounced by the 4-cost Law in Doflamingo, and also can be cleared by Black Hole in Teach. In this way, this card has a little bit less value than it would otherwise have, so depending on the meta, this card can come back into the deck, but currently, where these two decks are pretty prominent, I've decided to take it out. I think that there's a fourth very solid option that a lot of people will gravitate towards, and that is Purple Luffy. As I mentioned, I also have a Purple Luffy guide coming to Patreon, so if you guys are interested in that, then please check it out. I also put some more interesting things about the philosophy behind these more simple decks, but I think that if you're getting into the game and just want a really consistent and strong deck, then this is the choice over something like Shanks. Purple Luffy is an exceptionally consistent and powerful deck, but lacks in the fact that it has a big difference in power when it goes first versus second. In this way, a lot of it can be up to the dice roll, and if you can manage to go first and roll the way that you want to, you will actually win a lot of games. The deck is just extremely stable and extremely powerful due to the fact that with your leader ability and Defitaro, you can play a 7-cost 8,000 and a 5-cost 6,000 on what should be your 5 Dong, making it very hard for the opponent to fight back, as of course you have something like Gum Gum Giant as well to be able to hold onto the game if the opponent does decide to try to finish the game through your defenses. Thanks to the new Searcher in Trafalgar Law, as well as the Searcher that we got in the Purple Start deck in Roro Zoro, we now have a lot of consistency, and it makes it really easy to pull off this 4-cost Zoro into 7-cost Rufitaro and 5-cost Sangoro. Through these such cards, the consistency is very high, and the power is very high as well. The only issue, of course, is that if you're going second, you are doing the exact same moves, just one turn later. Of course, in this case, you end up being a little bit slower than your opponent as you get to attack second, but the power of the deck is still undeniably strong, so I think that it's a very solid pick if you just want to have something very consistent. In OP09, if you want to have your best chance at winning, I'd recommend one of these 4 decks. However, there are 3 decks that I still think are maybe a bit underrated within Japan and could do well in other regions with the right techs or with the right meta. The first one I'm going to be talking about is Bonney. Bonney was actually very popular for an instance in OP09, but that was before people really started to catch on to how good Shanks was. Other than the Shanks and Teach matchup, Bonney has a very good matchup spread against most of the meta, including Doflamingo. She actually beats Doflamingo quite well thanks to the fact that people can't really afford to run Red Rock in Doflamingo and can put up 8-cost Kid and then play through him. Through this 8-cost Kid plan, she has a very good matchup spread into a lot of decks that can't handle it, including things like Purple Luffy, which you might see as well. In this case, I think it's totally viable to bring Bonney to your regional, for example, because she has very good matchups into certain decks in the meta. You just need to be able to read the meta correctly and know when it's your turn to enter the rotating door. The Shanks matchup can be a struggle because your 8-cost Kid gets removed easily with any sort of power reduction. However, it is still fightable through the other top end. The Teach matchup, however, is quite difficult in general. However, one card that can absolutely help is 9-cost Zoro. 9-cost Zoro is a bit underutilized in the OP09 metagame in my opinion, but by playing 2 of these, 10-cost Teach can only lock 1 of them, so therefore the other one can run rampant, and then just hitting 16,000 3 times against a leader that's probably at 1-2 life at this point was going to really hurt them, especially for the number of resources that Teach has. In this way, I think that putting in 9-cost Zoro into this deck can really help, but of course the issue always is going to be space. So that leaves me with 2 more leaders that I want to talk about, and that is Blackbeard Luffy and Lucci. Now, if you play in the English version in OP08.5 right now, you'll know that Lucci and Blackbeard Luffy are 2 of some of the most dominant decks in the entire meta. So what happens to them in OP09? Well, let's answer that question first with talking about Blackbeard Luffy. First of all, Blackbeard Luffy has a very hard time beating the Teach matchup. Not only is the Blackbeard matchup basically unwinnable for Blackbeard Luffy, the Shanks matchup is also quite difficult as well, due to the fact that Shanks can turtle early game and then eventually start playing these large 10-cost 12,000 rush characters. It gets harder and harder for Blackbeard Luffy to eventually defend his life and eventually is run over. Therefore, due to these 2 matchups, you haven't seen Blackbeard Luffy in a little while. But what about Lucci? If Blackbeard Luffy is gone, then Lucci must have a really good time, right? However, Lucci actually has a similar problem to Blackbeard Luffy, where although he actually does beat Shanks, which to me gives him more merit than something like Blackbeard Luffy in this current meta, he still loses to Teach. If there isn't too much Teach, then you consider bringing him, but I think that the main key reason why you used to play Lucci before has been kind of weakened. In Japan in OP08.5, when we still had NES Lobby, you would choose to pick Lucci due to the fact that he could do really well into Red Purple Law and Doflamingo. However, due to the fact that both of these decks aren't necessarily as winnable, now that you don't have NES Lobby, there are some other better decks to choose in the meta. As such, although I think Lucci is rather underutilized in this meta, he does tend to struggle a little bit against some of these more popular decks. Although I do think that the Doflamingo matchup is still slightly Lucci favored, it's not as winning as it used to be before. We have seen techs recently, like the 9-cost Kaido, to make the Lucci versus Blackbeard matchup a little bit better. However, it doesn't necessarily make it winning, and as such, maybe with a little bit more clicking from the West, we might be able to see Lucci a little bit more. This may be good news or bad news depending on which decks you like to play. Lastly, as a bit of a bonus, I want to talk about Red Purple Luffy. Now, I can't say that I recommend this deck because it does actually have a bad Doflamingo matchup. Due to the fact that Doflamingos made their lists much faster with things like 2 costs each, the matchup has become a bit of a struggle, and now if you don't go first, you are in fact struggling with this deck. If you do go first as Red Purple Luffy against Doflamingo, you still do have a fairly good chance. However, the main reason why you would use Red Purple Luffy is due to the fact that you can beat Shanks and Purple Luffy very easily. The Teach matchup's also not too difficult depending on the build and depending on how you can roll your cards. But Red Purple Luffy in general is just a deck that a lot of people enjoy playing, so I thought I might as well put it in here. And it's a deck that I used a lot in OP09 due to the fact that I just enjoyed playing it, and it was really just good enough to get me the wins when I needed them. Unlike Purple Luffy, the deck's actually very flexible, allowing you to tech for certain matchups that Purple Luffy would otherwise struggle in, such as Lucci. If you are curious about some sort of tech cards like 4-cost Frankie, I talk about it in videos such as this one. Although I would argue that there is a definitive best deck in this meta, it's not like the other metas where there was one deck where if you're not using it, you're kind of trolling, and if you are using it, you're winning. For this reason, a lot of decks can be viable depending on the meta as well. Even things like Green Purple Doflamingo or Blue Purple Reiju can do well depending on the meta. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I hope that visually it was interesting for you as well. I'm trying to up my content as much as I can. I will keep trying to improve my content. If you guys would like to join me on this journey where I talk about the meta, if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more things talking about the OP09 meta, OP10 meta, and beyond, then please make sure to subscribe. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you guys next time, and Merry Christmas!